Yesterday, the world ended. Not with fire, not with explosions, not with sirens or collapsing cities. No one screamed, no one ran. In fact, everyone woke up this morning exactly the same. Traffic still crawled through crowded streets, phones still buzzed with notifications. The sun rose over the same familiar buildings. Your friends laughed, your neighbors went to work. The news talked about the same ordinary problems. But something is wrong. Something subtle, something that only you seem to notice. The birds outside your window sound different. A street you've walked your whole life suddenly feels unfamiliar. People repeat the same phrases, almost word for word. It's as if reality restarted overnight, and you're the only one who remembers the version that came before. So what if the world really did end yesterday? Not with destruction, but with replacement. What if everything you see right now is a perfect copy of the world that existed before? A world rebuilt, a civilization restarted, and somehow you slipped through the reset. Today, we're exploring a question that sits at the intersection of history, philosophy, and the deepest fears humanity has ever had. What if the world ended yesterday, and only you noticed? Because if that were true, the signs wouldn't be obvious. They would be hidden, buried in memory, in strange historical patterns, in the quiet feeling that something about reality is slightly off. And the deeper we look into history, the more unsettling this possibility becomes, because humanity has faced moments before that look eerily similar to a reset. If you enjoy deep, mind-bending stories about history, mysteries, and the strange questions that keep philosophers awake at night, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I'm curious about something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? What time is it for you? Or maybe tell me something about your day, your job, your city, or what you were doing just before you clicked on this video. Because somewhere out there, thousands of people are listening to this story at the same moment, and that simple fact becomes strangely important when we start asking, what happens if the world itself suddenly changes? Now, let's begin.
The first thing you notice is that nothing feels different. Morning light still slips through the window exactly the way it did yesterday. The same pale glow stretches across the floor, touching the same corners of the room. The clock beside your bed ticks forward with mechanical indifference, each second sounding completely normal. Yet something inside you hesitates. Not fear, not panic, just a quiet, nagging sensation that something about this morning does not belong to the world you remember. You step outside. Cars pass on the street. Someone walks a dog. A bus rumbles by, carrying half-awake commuters staring at glowing screens. The air smells like rain and pavement, just like any other day. But there's a strange thought pressing against the edge of your mind. What if this isn't the same world you fell asleep in? Not because the buildings changed, not because the sky looks different, but because the version of reality itself might have shifted, quietly, invisibly, sometime between midnight and sunrise. It sounds impossible, but history has taught us something unsettling about the way worlds actually end. They almost never end the way we imagine. When people picture the end of the world, they imagine firestorms, meteors, tidal waves swallowing continents. Hollywood has trained us to expect drama, explosions that announce the final moment of existence. Reality is far stranger. In real history, worlds end quietly. Sometimes so quietly that the people living inside them don't realize it has already happened. Consider the citizens of ancient Rome in the year 476 AD. For centuries, Rome had been the center of the known world. Roads stretched across continents. Legions guarded distant borders. Cities pulsed with trade, politics, and culture. The Roman world felt permanent, eternal. But on a September day in that year, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a young boy named Romulus Augustus, was quietly removed from power by a Germanic warlord named Odoacer. There were no fireworks, no final battle echoing across the empire. The imperial throne was simply gone. And yet most people in the empire woke up the next morning and continued their lives exactly the same. Farmers still worked fields, merchants still sold goods, children still played in the streets. For the average person living in a distant village, the Roman Empire did not collapse in a single moment. Instead, their world slowly dissolved over decades, so gradually that many never realized they had crossed the boundary between two entirely different ages. Historians today call it the fall of Rome, but for the people living through it, it felt less like a fall and more like waking up in a slightly different world. A world where the rules had quietly changed. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Maya civilization once filled Central America with towering cities, pyramids, and millions of people. Their astronomers tracked the stars with astonishing precision. Their kings ruled powerful kingdoms carved from jungle landscapes. Then, sometime between the 8th and 9th centuries, something strange began to happen. The great cities started emptying. Temples were abandoned. Roads fell silent. Within a few generations, entire urban worlds had vanished into the forest. Today, archaeologists walk through ruins swallowed by vines and trees, trying to understand what happened. Drought, war, ecological collapse. Many explanations exist. But one detail remains haunting. There was no single catastrophic moment. The civilization didn't explode. It simply faded, until the world that had once existed there was gone. Now imagine living inside that transition. Imagine waking up in a village where the nearby city used to glow with torchlight and music every night, and gradually noticing fewer travelers pass by, fewer markets open, fewer voices fill the air. At what point would you realize your entire world had already ended? And what if that realization came too late? The unsettling truth is that humans are remarkably bad at recognizing the moment when history changes. Our brains are designed to normalize the present. We adapt to small differences so quickly that yesterday's world quietly slips away without resistance. Psychologists call this change blindness. In laboratory experiments, researchers have shown that people often fail to notice dramatic changes happening directly in front of them. A person giving directions might be swapped with a completely different individual behind a moving door, and the observer never notices. Buildings disappear from photographs. Objects change color. Entire scenes shift. And the human mind calmly fills the gap. We assume the world is stable because our brains need stability to function. But what if reality itself changed in a way that looked almost identical to before? Would we notice? Or would our minds quietly smooth over the difference, allowing life to continue as if nothing had happened? There's an even stranger possibility hiding inside that question. Imagine a perfect copy of the world being created overnight. Every street rebuilt atom by atom. Every building reconstructed exactly the same. Every person recreated with identical memories and personalities. If that happened, billions of people would wake up believing nothing had changed. Because their memories would confirm it. Their experiences would confirm it. Everything would match the world they remembered. Except for one thing. The world they remembered would technically no longer exist. It would be a reconstruction, a replica. And if there was even the smallest flaw in that reconstruction, a single misplaced detail, a faint inconsistency, someone might eventually notice. Maybe not everyone, but perhaps one person. Imagine that person standing on a familiar street corner, suddenly realizing the cafe on the corner used to have a green sign instead of a red one, or remembering a song lyric that everyone else insists never existed, or feeling a subtle shift in the rhythm of everyday life, something impossible to describe, but impossible to ignore. At first, they might assume it's just memory playing tricks. Memory is unreliable after all. But the feeling wouldn't disappear, because deep down, something inside them would keep whispering the same impossible thought. What if the world that existed yesterday no longer exists today? Throughout history, humans have been haunted by similar ideas. Ancient myths often describe cycles where the world is destroyed and recreated again and again. Entire civilizations wiped away by floods, fires, or divine resets. In many of those stories, there is always a survivor. One witness who remembers the previous world. One person who carries the memory of what existed before. Why does this idea appear in so many cultures separated by oceans and centuries? Why do so many myths insist that worlds do not simply continue forever, but instead end, restart, and begin again? Perhaps those myths were just metaphors for natural disasters, or perhaps they reflect something deeper about the way humans perceive reality. Because the unsettling truth is that the boundary between one world and the next may not look dramatic at all. It may look exactly like this moment right now. A quiet morning, a familiar street, a sky that seems unchanged, and a single person standing in the middle of it all, slowly beginning to wonder if yesterday's world has already disappeared. Because if the world truly ended yesterday, the most terrifying possibility isn't that everything would look different. It's that everything would look exactly the same. And that realization leads to an even more disturbing question. If worlds can disappear so quietly, how many have already vanished throughout history without anyone noticing? To answer that, we have to travel deeper into the past, into moments when entire civilizations collapsed in silence. Moments when millions of people crossed the invisible line between one world and another, without realizing they had already left the old one behind. And the deeper we dig into those forgotten endings, the clearer one thing becomes. Human history may not be a straight line. It may be a series of worlds, ending one by one, quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. Which brings us to the next mystery. Because if worlds rarely end with explosions, then how do they actually disappear? The answer lies in something history is full of, yet rarely talks about: the silent collapse.
History rarely announces its endings. There is almost never a single moment when a trumpet sounds and the world officially changes. No universal alarm rings across continents, telling people that the era they grew up in has just vanished. Instead, worlds tend to end the way a forest dies, slowly, quietly. One tree falls, then another. A river shifts course. The animals migrate somewhere else. Years pass before anyone realizes the forest they once knew no longer exists. Civilizations collapse the same way. Take the ancient city of Pompeii. Today it is remembered for catastrophe, a sudden volcanic eruption in the year 79 AD that buried an entire Roman city beneath ash from Mount Vesuvius. The destruction was violent and immediate, freezing people and buildings in time. But Pompeii is unusual precisely because the end was so dramatic. Most civilizations do not end like Pompeii. Most end like the Bronze Age. Around 1200 BC, the entire network of powerful Mediterranean civilizations began to unravel.
Kingdoms that had dominated the ancient world for centuries, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, and powerful trading empires across the Near East, suddenly began to disappear. Cities burned, trade routes collapsed, writing systems vanished. Within a few generations, the entire interconnected world of the Bronze Age had disintegrated. Historians still debate what caused it. Some point to climate change and drought. Others suspect invasions by mysterious raiders known as the Sea Peoples. There may have been earthquakes, internal rebellions, or economic collapse. The truth may be that all of these pressures happened at once. But what makes this collapse so eerie is how incomplete our understanding remains. Imagine living in that era. For centuries, ships had crossed the Mediterranean carrying copper, tin, spices, and ideas. Kings exchanged letters written in elegant scripts on clay tablets. Diplomacy connected distant courts across thousands of miles. Then, gradually, the ships stopped coming. Trade slowed. Cities fortified their walls. Rumors of unrest spread across the sea. At first, it might have seemed temporary, just another difficult decade in a long history of ups and downs. But then entire kingdoms stopped responding. Libraries burned, roads fell silent, and one by one, the great powers of the Bronze Age faded into history. For the people living through it, there was no official announcement that their world had ended. The collapse unfolded slowly enough that life continued day by day. Yet by the time historians looked back centuries later, it was clear that something enormous had happened. A global civilization had vanished. It had been replaced by a darker, quieter age. And most people who experienced the transition probably never realized they had crossed the boundary between two entirely different worlds. The same quiet transformation has repeated itself again and again throughout human history. Consider the city of Angkor in Cambodia. In the 12th century, Angkor was one of the largest cities on Earth. Vast temples rose above a complex network of canals, reservoirs, and roads. The Khmer Empire that built it commanded immense power across Southeast Asia. At its peak, Angkor may have supported nearly 1 million people. Then something began to change. The water system that sustained the city became unstable. Monsoon patterns shifted. Political struggles weakened the empire's control over distant territories. Over time, the great temples were slowly abandoned. The jungle moved in. For centuries afterward, travelers occasionally stumbled upon massive stone towers rising from the forest, silent reminders of a civilization that once thrived there. When European explorers rediscovered Angkor in the 19th century, the ruins seemed almost mythical. How could such an enormous city simply disappear? But the answer was simple. It didn't disappear overnight. It faded. A generation moved away, then another. The population shrank gradually until the city that once held 1 million voices stood empty beneath the trees. The world that had existed there simply ended. But perhaps the most unsettling example of silent collapse comes from a place far closer to modern times. In the early 20th century, the city of Detroit in the United States symbolized industrial power. Its factories produced millions of automobiles, fueling the global economy. Workers poured into the city seeking opportunity and stability.
Detroit was a city that felt unstoppable. But beginning in the 1950s, the forces shaping the world started to shift. Manufacturing moved elsewhere, automation changed the nature of labor. Economic pressures slowly hollowed out the industries that had once sustained the city. Decade by decade, Detroit shrank. Neighborhoods emptied, factories closed, entire blocks fell into silence. At its peak, Detroit had nearly 2 million residents. Today, that number is less than half. For the people living there during the decline, the transformation didn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened gradually, year by year, job by job, family by family. And that is how worlds truly end. Not with explosions, but with quiet transitions that stretch across decades until one day someone looks around and realizes they are living in a completely different reality. What makes this idea so unsettling is that it reveals something about human perception. We are not very good at recognizing large changes while they are happening. Our brains are built to focus on immediate concerns, today's work, today's problems, today's routines. The larger patterns of history often remain invisible to those living inside them. It's only when historians look backward that the shape of an ending becomes clear. But what if we applied that same idea to something even bigger? Not just civilizations, not just empires, but the entire world. Imagine that something happened yesterday, something profound enough to change reality itself. Maybe it wasn't a physical destruction. Maybe it was a transformation of systems, structures, or even the underlying rules of existence. Would billions of people immediately recognize it? Or would they continue living their lives, adapting quietly to the new conditions without realizing the old world had vanished? History suggests the second possibility is far more likely, because humans are incredibly adaptable. We accept new realities quickly, often without questioning them. And sometimes the moment when everything changes passes so quietly that it leaves almost no trace. There's a chilling thought experiment that historians sometimes discuss. Imagine standing in the year 1491 in the Americas, just before European ships arrived from across the Atlantic. Millions of people lived across the continents, speaking hundreds of languages, practicing unique traditions, building cities, trading goods, and shaping landscapes. Then, within the next century, diseases carried from Europe swept through the Americas. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Entire societies were devastated by epidemics they had no immunity against. Historians estimate that as much as 90% of the population in some regions may have died. An entire world of cultures and civilizations collapsed within a few generations. And yet, much of that history vanished along with the people who lived it. The world that existed in 1491 disappeared so thoroughly that later generations barely understood how rich and complex it had been. A world ended, quietly, tragically. And the new world that emerged afterward looked very different from the one that had existed before. Now, imagine that pattern repeating again and again throughout time. Worlds ending, new ones beginning. Each transition subtle enough that most people living through it barely notice the shift, until centuries later, historians look back and realize that something enormous happened. If that is how history works, then the possibility becomes strangely unsettling, because it means the moment when a world ends may not feel dramatic at all. It may simply feel like another ordinary day. Which brings us back to the question that started this journey. What if yesterday was one of those moments? What if something fundamental about the world changed, and most people simply adapted without noticing? That possibility becomes even stranger when we consider the next layer of the mystery. Because even if the world changed dramatically overnight, there is one force powerful enough to hide the evidence from almost everyone on Earth: human memory. And as we're about to discover, memory may be the most fragile and unreliable record of reality we possess, which raises a disturbing possibility. What if the reason no one remembers yesterday's world is because memory itself can be rewritten?
Memory feels permanent. If someone asked you what you did yesterday, you could probably describe it in detail. You might remember the color of the sky when you stepped outside, the sound of your phone vibrating in your pocket, the taste of the first sip of coffee in the morning. Those memories feel solid, reliable, like small anchors tying your mind to the reality that actually happened. But the deeper scientists have studied memory, the more unsettling the truth has become. Memory is not a recording, it's a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, your brain is not simply playing back a stored video of the past. Instead, it rebuilds the event piece by piece, using fragments of stored information, emotional cues, and assumptions about how the world works. That means every memory is slightly rewritten each time it's recalled. And sometimes those rewrites introduce details that never existed at all. Psychologists have demonstrated this in experiments that feel almost impossible to believe. In one famous study, researchers showed participants a video of a car accident. Later, they asked different groups of people a simple question: how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Another group heard the same question, but with a slightly different word: how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? That one word changed everything. Participants who heard the word smashed consistently remembered the cars moving faster than those who heard the word hit. Some even reported seeing broken glass that never appeared in the video. Their brains had quietly rewritten the event. The memory felt real, but it wasn't accurate. This phenomenon is known as false memory, and it happens far more often than people realize. Researchers have managed to convince participants that they were lost in a shopping mall as children, even when it never happened. Others have been persuaded they once took a hot air balloon ride that never existed. Once these memories take hold, people describe them vividly. They can picture the environment, they remember emotions, yet the events themselves are completely fictional. This raises a disturbing possibility. If individual memories can be altered so easily, what about collective memory? What happens when entire societies remember events in slightly different ways than they actually occurred? History is filled with examples of this. There's a strange phenomenon sometimes called the Mandela effect, a term used to describe situations where large groups of people share the same incorrect memory. Many people remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison during the 1980s. They recall seeing news reports about it. They remember conversations discussing the tragedy. Yet Mandela didn't die in prison. He was released in 1990 and later became president of South Africa, living until 2013. So why do so many people remember something that never happened? Similar shared misrememberings appear everywhere. People remember famous movie lines differently from how they were actually spoken. Brand logos appear different in memory than in reality. Entire cultural details shift slightly when people recall them years later. Most scientists believe these effects are simply the result of how memory works, small inaccuracies spreading through social communication until they become widely shared. But for some people, the idea feels far more mysterious. They wonder whether these strange mismatches between memory and reality might hint to something deeper. What if reality itself changed, but memories of the previous versions somehow lingered? Imagine waking up in a world that is almost identical to yesterday's, except for a handful of tiny details. A historical event happened on a slightly different date. A famous quote was phrased differently. A childhood book you loved suddenly contains a line you swear was never there before. Most people would simply assume their memory was mistaken. Memory is imperfect, after all. But what if your memory wasn't wrong? What if you were remembering something from a version of the world that no longer exists? It sounds like science fiction, yet the idea connects to something historians constantly wrestle with. Our understanding of the past depends entirely on records and memory. But records can be lost. Documents burn in fires, libraries collapse in wars, and human memory fades far faster than written history. There are entire chapters of human civilization that we know almost nothing about because the memories of those eras disappeared. Consider the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization in ancient Greece.
For centuries, powerful kingdoms dominated the region. They built fortified palaces and developed a sophisticated writing system known as Linear B. Then, around 1200 BC, those palaces burned. The writing system vanished. For hundreds of years afterward, Greece entered what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period when literacy disappeared and written records became almost non-existent. When writing finally returned centuries later, the Greeks themselves barely remembered the civilization that had existed before them. The stories of heroes like Achilles and Odysseus survived only as myths passed down through oral tradition. But the details of the real world those myths came from had largely vanished from memory. Imagine living during that transition. Your grandparents might have remembered a time when scribes recorded events on clay tablets. They might have spoken of powerful kings ruling from grand palaces. But by your lifetime, those palaces were ruins. The writing system was forgotten. The world your grandparents described sounded almost mythical, like stories from a lost age. Over time, the memory of that civilization faded so thoroughly that later generations believed it had always been part of legend. Reality had quietly rewritten history. And this pattern appears again and again. Libraries burned in Alexandria, destroying countless ancient works. Oral traditions vanished when cultures disappeared. Entire languages died out, taking unique ways of understanding the world with them. Every time that happens, humanity loses part of its memory, which means our picture of history is incomplete. There may be entire worlds that existed before our own that we barely remember. Civilizations whose stories were erased when their records vanished. Knowledge that disappeared when the people who carried it were gone. The unsettling implication is that humanity's memory of the past is not a continuous story. It's more like a fragmented mosaic, pieces missing, details blurred, and occasionally strange gaps where something once existed but left almost no trace behind. If that's true, then it becomes possible, at least in theory, for entire realities to slip through those gaps, not because the events didn't happen, but because no reliable memory of them survived. And that idea leads to an even stranger thought. What if the world did end yesterday? Not in flames, but in a quiet transformation. Most people would wake up believing everything was normal because their memories would confirm it. Their minds would reconstruct yesterday exactly the way they expected. But if even one person retained a slightly different memory, a detail that didn't match the new version of reality, they might begin to suspect something had changed. At first, they might doubt themselves. Memory is unreliable after all. But the feeling wouldn't disappear, because somewhere deep in their mind would be the echo of a world that existed before, a world that everyone else seems to have forgotten. And that raises a question historians and philosophers have debated for centuries. What if history itself has experienced moments when reality seemed to reset? Moments when the direction of the world shifted so suddenly that people living through them felt as though they had stepped into an entirely new era overnight. Because if you look closely enough at the timeline of human civilization, you start to notice something strange. There are points where history doesn't just evolve, it jumps. Entire systems collapse, new ideas appear, and the world that emerges afterward feels so different from what came before that it almost seems like a fresh beginning. Almost like the world itself started over. And once you begin searching for those moments, you realize something unsettling. History may contain far more resets than we ever imagined, which brings us to the next part of the mystery. The moments when history itself seems to have changed direction overnight.
There are moments in history when the world seems to turn a corner so sharply that everything afterward feels like a different reality. Not gradually, not slowly, but almost overnight. For the people living through those moments, it must have felt like waking up in a world where the rules had suddenly changed. The strange part is that when historians look back at these turning points, they often struggle to explain how they happened so quickly. Entire systems collapse, new ideas appear, old beliefs that once seemed permanent suddenly vanish. It's almost as if history occasionally hits a reset button. One of the clearest examples happened in the late 18th century. For centuries, Europe had been dominated by kings and queens who ruled by what they claimed was divine right. Monarchies controlled nations, and most people accepted that hierarchy as the natural order of the world. Then, something strange began to spread. Ideas. Quietly at first. Philosophers like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Locke began writing about liberty, rights, and the idea that governments should serve the people rather than rule over them. At first, these ideas were just words on paper, discussed in salons and universities. But within a few decades, they began reshaping entire nations. In 1776, 13 colonies on the edge of the Atlantic declared independence from the British Empire. The event would later be known as the American Revolution. Suddenly, the idea that ordinary people could overthrow a king was no longer theoretical. Then, only 13 years later, something even more dramatic happened. In 1789, crowds gathered in Paris and stormed a fortress prison known as the Bastille. The moment marked the beginning of the French Revolution. Within a few years, one of the most powerful monarchies in Europe collapsed. The king was executed. Aristocrats fled the country. The old social order, something that had dominated Europe for centuries, disintegrated almost overnight. For the people living through it, the transformation must have felt surreal. One year, the king ruled by divine authority. A few years later, the monarchy itself had vanished. The world had changed. But perhaps the most fascinating part of these moments is how quickly people adapt to the new reality. Within a generation, ideas that once seemed radical become normal. Children grow up in the new world and assume it has always been that way. The old world fades into memory. History resets itself. This pattern appears again and again. Consider the year 1914. For decades, Europe had enjoyed an era historians later called the Long Peace. Empires ruled vast territories, and although tensions simmered beneath the surface, many people believed the continent had entered a stable, modern age. Then, in June of that year, an assassination occurred in the city of Sarajevo. A young nationalist shot an Austrian archduke named Archduke Franz Ferdinand. At first, the event seemed like a regional political crisis, but within weeks, alliances pulled nation after nation into conflict. The world plunged into what we now call World War I. Millions of soldiers marched into trenches stretching across Europe. Entire empires collapsed, including the Ottoman, Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian. The global political map transformed dramatically. But if you could travel back to the summer of 1914, before the war began, you would find people enjoying ordinary life. Cafes were full, trains carried passengers across peaceful landscapes. Most citizens had no idea they were standing at the edge of a historical cliff. Then the war came, and within 4 years, the world that existed before it had vanished. When the war ended, the new century looked completely different from the one that began it. Sometimes these resets happen not through war, but through ideas. Think about the moment when humanity realized the Earth was not the center of the universe. For centuries, people believed the heavens revolved around our planet. It seemed obvious. The sun rose and set each day. Stars moved across the sky. Everything appeared to circle Earth. But in the 16th century, a Polish astronomer named Nicolaus Copernicus proposed something radical. What if Earth itself moved around the sun? At first, the idea sounded absurd. It contradicted centuries of accepted belief. But over time, evidence mounted. Astronomers like Galileo Galilei and Johannes Kepler expanded the theory.
Eventually, humanity was forced to accept something astonishing. The entire cosmic model of reality had been wrong. The Earth was not the center of the universe. The universe itself suddenly felt far larger and far stranger than anyone had imagined. This moment became known as the Copernican Revolution.
But think about what it must have felt like to live during that shift. One generation believed they lived at the center of creation. The next generation discovered they were orbiting a star in a vast cosmos. The world hadn't physically changed, yet the way humans understood reality had completely reset. These are the moments when history seems to take a sudden leap forward, leaving the old worldview behind. But sometimes the resets are even stranger. There are periods in the historical record where entire centuries seem to become hazy. Historians debate gaps where written documentation suddenly decreases. Records disappear. Events become difficult to verify. One controversial idea even suggests that parts of early medieval history might have been misdated or poorly recorded, creating what some call phantom centuries. Most historians reject the extreme versions of this theory, but the fact that such debates exist reveals something important. Our timeline of the past is not perfectly clear. There are shadows in the historical record, moments where knowledge fades. And whenever that happens, it leaves room for unsettling possibilities. Because if entire chapters of history can become blurred or forgotten, it raises a question few people like to consider. How many times might the world have already changed in ways that later generations barely understood? How many transitions between eras felt ordinary to the people living through them, but appear enormous when viewed from centuries later? The Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the Digital Age. Each of these moments reshaped human civilization so dramatically that people born afterward lived in a fundamentally different world than their grandparents. Yet those transformations didn't feel like the end of the world while they were happening. They felt like progress, like change, like the natural flow of time. But step back far enough and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. History doesn't move smoothly forward. It leaps. It resets. Entire ways of living vanish, replaced by something new. And the deeper we explore the past, the more we find echoes of worlds that disappeared almost completely. Worlds that left behind ruins, fragments, and mysterious gaps in memory. Which leads us to the next question. Because scattered across the planet are silent witnesses to civilizations that seem to have vanished almost entirely. Massive cities swallowed by desert and jungle. Structures so ancient that no one remembers who built them. Ghosts of worlds that once existed and then quietly ended. And when you stand among those ruins, a strange thought begins to form. What if our world isn't the first one to reach this level of civilization? What if others came before us and disappeared so thoroughly that history barely remembers them? Welcome to the next part of the mystery, the ghosts of previous worlds.
If you travel far enough across the Earth, you eventually arrive at places that feel wrong. Not frightening, not dangerous, just strangely silent. Massive stone structures rise from landscapes where no large cities exist anymore. Roads stretch across valleys that lead nowhere. Entire complexes of temples and walls stand in regions that now seem too remote to have supported the civilizations that once built them. These places are the fingerprints of worlds that vanished, and the more archaeologists uncover them, the stranger the story becomes. One of the most famous examples sits high in the Andes Mountains of Peru. The city, known as Machu Picchu, rests on a ridge nearly 8,000 feet above sea level. Terraced stone walls climb the mountainside, carefully fitted together without mortar, forming buildings that have survived centuries of earthquakes and weather. When the Spanish arrived in South America during the 16th century, they never discovered this place. The jungle slowly reclaimed it. For nearly 400 years, the city remained hidden until the American explorer Hiram Bingham brought international attention to it in 1911. By then, the civilization that built it, the Inca Empire, had already disappeared. When archaeologists study Machu Picchu today, they find something fascinating. The city was not destroyed in war, it was simply abandoned. The buildings remain intact, the terraces still cling to the mountainside. It's as if the inhabitants walked away one day and never returned. That eerie quiet exists in many ancient places. Across the deserts of modern-day Jordan stands the city of Petra. Carved directly into rose-colored cliffs, its towering facades once marked the capital of the Nabatean kingdom. Caravans filled with spices and silk once passed through its gates. Merchants negotiated trade deals in its markets. Water channels and reservoirs supported thousands of residents in the middle of the desert. But over time, trade routes shifted. The Roman Empire absorbed the kingdom. Earthquakes damaged the infrastructure that kept the city alive. Gradually, Petra emptied. By the Middle Ages, it had largely vanished from global awareness. Travelers occasionally stumbled upon the ruins, but the vibrant world that once existed there had faded into memory. Another ghostly reminder rises from the jungles of Central America. The towering pyramids of Tikal pierce through the rainforest canopy like stone mountains. During its peak, Tikal was one of the most powerful cities of the Maya civilization. Its rulers commanded armies. Its astronomers charted the movements of planets with remarkable precision. At night, thousands of torches would have illuminated the plazas and temples. Yet today, the jungle surrounds those pyramids with an almost unnatural quiet. Birds call from the trees, wind rustles through leaves, and the city itself stands empty. What happened to the people who once filled these places? The answers vary. Sometimes war drove populations away. Sometimes environmental changes made survival difficult. Sometimes trade networks collapsed, leaving cities isolated. But there are cases where archaeologists still struggle to understand why an entire society disappeared. Consider the mysterious site of Göbekli Tepe. When researchers began excavating it in the 1990s, they uncovered something astonishing. Massive stone pillars arranged in circular temples, carvings of animals etched into their surfaces. The structures were clearly the work of an organized society with advanced planning and craftsmanship. But there was one problem. The site was more than 11,000 years old. That meant it was built long before historians believed large-scale architecture even existed. According to traditional timelines, humans at that time were still mostly hunter-gatherers. Yet here was undeniable evidence that complex ritual sites had already been constructed thousands of years earlier than expected. Even more puzzling, the people who built Göbekli Tepe later buried the entire complex under tons of soil, deliberately. Why would a civilization bury its own monumental structures? What happened to the society that created them? Archaeologists continue to investigate, but the site has already forced historians to rethink early human civilization. It suggests that the story of humanity's past may be far more complex than we once believed. And sometimes the clues left behind feel almost eerie. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean lies a tiny island known as Easter Island. Scattered across its landscape are nearly 1,000 enormous stone statues called moai. Each statue represents a human figure carved from volcanic rock.
Some weigh more than 80 tons. The people who built them were part of the ancient Rapa Nui culture. For centuries, they carved and transported these massive figures across the island. Then something went wrong. The forests that once covered the island disappeared. Resources became scarce. Society fractured. By the time Europeans arrived in the 18th century, the population had collapsed dramatically. The statues remained, staring silently across the landscape like witnesses to a world that no longer existed. Standing among ruins like these can create a strange sensation. You realize that entire civilizations once lived full lives in these places. Children played in streets that are now covered in vines.
Leaders made decisions that shaped the destiny of their people. Artists carved monuments, believing their creations would last forever. And yet, time erased almost all of it. Cities vanished, languages disappeared, stories were forgotten. What remains are fragments, ghosts. But perhaps the most unsettling thought comes when you begin to imagine the future. One day, thousands of years from now, archaeologists, whoever they might be, may uncover the ruins of our own cities. They might walk through the skeletal remains of skyscrapers. They might study broken pieces of technology buried beneath layers of sediment. They might try to reconstruct the world we live in today from scattered artifacts. And they might wonder the same question we ask about ancient civilizations. What happened to them? Why did their world end? Because if history has taught us anything, it's that no civilization lasts forever. Every society eventually reaches a point where its structures change or collapse. Sometimes the transition is slow. Sometimes it happens with shocking speed. But eventually, every world becomes a ghost of the past. And that realization leads to a deeper question. What if the pattern of rising and falling civilizations is only part of the story? What if the universe itself operates in cycles, beginnings and endings repeating over and over again? Modern science has begun exploring ideas that sound almost like mythology. The possibility that reality itself might reset, that universes could begin, expand, collapse, and begin again. Which leads us into one of the strangest questions humanity has ever seriously considered. What if the world doesn't just end through history? What if the entire universe can be restarted? And if that's true, would anyone inside it ever notice? For most of human history, the idea that reality itself might not be exactly what it appears sounded like pure fantasy. Philosophers wondered about illusions and perception, but the physical universe seemed solid and unquestionable. The ground beneath our feet felt real. The stars above us felt distant but tangible. Reality was simply reality. But during the last century, something strange began to happen. Science started revealing that the universe behaves in ways that feel almost impossible to reconcile with everyday intuition. The deeper physicists looked into the nature of existence, the more it began to resemble something unexpectedly structured, almost like a system. One of the first shocks came from the world of quantum mechanics. When scientists studied the tiniest particles in existence, they discovered behavior that defied common sense. Particles could exist in multiple states at once. They could behave like waves and particles simultaneously. Even more puzzling, the act of observing them seemed to influence how they behaved. This strange phenomenon became known as quantum superposition. In simple terms, it suggested that at the smallest scales, reality might not settle into a definite state until something observes it. The idea unsettled even the scientists studying it. The physicist Albert Einstein famously resisted these implications, describing some aspects of quantum mechanics as spooky. But the evidence kept growing. Experiments repeatedly confirmed that the universe does not behave like a simple mechanical machine. Instead, it operates through probabilities, strange interactions, and rules that often feel more mathematical than physical. Some scientists began to ask a radical question. If reality is governed by precise mathematical laws, could the universe itself operate like a vast computational system? This line of thinking eventually led to one of the most controversial ideas in modern philosophy, the simulation hypothesis. The concept gained widespread attention after philosopher Nick Bostrom proposed a formal argument in 2003. Bostrom suggested that if advanced civilizations eventually develop the ability to simulate entire universes, then it becomes statistically possible, even likely, that we might already be inside such a simulation.
Not a video game exactly, but a computational reality capable of modeling every particle, every event, every conscious mind. At first glance, the idea seems outrageous, yet some aspects of modern physics have made it surprisingly difficult to dismiss entirely. Consider the speed of light. Nothing in the universe can move faster than this limit, approximately 299,792 kilometers per second. It acts like a fundamental boundary for how information travels through space. To physicists, this limit behaves almost like a processing cap in a system. Then there is the strange fact that the universe appears to operate on discrete units. Energy is quantized. Matter is made of fundamental particles. Even space and time may be divided into the smallest measurable units known as Planck lengths and Planck time intervals. In other words, the universe might not be infinitely continuous. It may have a smallest resolution, much like pixels on a screen. None of this proves we are living in a simulation, but it raises fascinating possibilities. If reality were a simulation, then the concept of a world ending might look very different from the apocalyptic visions humans often imagine. Instead of destruction, a simulated world could simply be reset. The system could reload a previous state. Variables could change. The environment could continue running with only minor adjustments. Most inhabitants inside that system would never notice. Their memories, their perceptions, even their sense of continuity would be part of the simulation itself. From their perspective, life would simply go on. But what if something went slightly wrong during the reset? What if a tiny memory fragment remained, or a tiny inconsistency appeared in the reconstructed world? Someone might notice a detail that doesn't match their recollection, a historical fact slightly different, a location subtly altered. The difference might be so small that most people dismiss it.
Yet, for the person who notices, the feeling could be deeply unsettling, like remembering a dream that no one else recalls. Interestingly, many cultures throughout history have described reality in ways that resemble this idea. Ancient Hindu philosophy speaks of the universe as a cosmic illusion known as Maya, a temporary manifestation within a deeper underlying reality. Some interpretations of Buddhist thought describe existence as a constantly shifting process rather than a fixed physical world. Even the ancient Greek philosopher Plato imagined reality as something like shadows cast on a wall, while the true world existed beyond what human senses could perceive. Of course, these ideas were philosophical metaphors rather than scientific hypotheses, but the similarity is striking. For thousands of years, humans have wrestled with the possibility that reality may not be as straightforward as it seems. Modern technology has made the idea even more intriguing. Every year, computers become more powerful. Video games create increasingly realistic worlds. Artificial intelligence generates environments, characters, and entire landscapes from pure data. What seems impossible today may eventually become achievable. Imagine a civilization thousands or millions of years more advanced than our own. Their technology could potentially simulate entire universes with incredible detail, not for entertainment alone, perhaps for research, perhaps to study history, perhaps to explore alternate timelines. If such simulations exist anywhere in the cosmos, the number of simulated realities might vastly outnumber the number of original ones. And that leads to a strange statistical argument. If there are millions of simulated worlds for every real one, the odds that we happen to exist in the original universe might actually be quite small. Again, this does not mean the simulation hypothesis is true, but it forces us to confront an unsettling possibility. Reality may be more flexible than we assume. The universe might not be a single permanent structure. It might be something capable of change, adjustment, or even restart. And if that were possible, the end of the world might not involve destruction at all. It could simply mean the system transitioned to a new state, everything continuing, but slightly different. Which brings us back to the strange idea we began with. What if the world ended yesterday?
If reality were capable of resetting itself through physics we don't yet understand or through mechanisms far beyond human technology, the transition might look perfectly ordinary from the inside. The sun would still rise, cities would still stand, people would still wake up and check their phones. Life would appear completely normal, except for one unsettling possibility. What if someone noticed? Not because they saw the reset happen, but because something inside their memory didn't align with the new version of reality. That idea might sound like the beginning of a science fiction story. Yet interestingly, stories like this appear again and again across cultures. Legends about survivors who remember a previous world, myths about individuals who lived through a cosmic reset, narratives where only one person carries the memory of what existed before everything changed. Why does this idea repeat so often in human storytelling? Why do so many traditions imagine a single witness to the end of a world? Because the most haunting possibility of all is not that reality might reset. It's that, if it did, only one person might remember it. And that brings us to the next part of our journey, the story of the one who remembers.
Across thousands of years of storytelling, a strange pattern appears again and again. Civilizations rise, the world collapses. A flood, a fire, a cosmic catastrophe sweeps away everything that once existed. And yet, someone survives. Not always a hero, not always a king, sometimes just a witness, someone who remembers the world that came before. The repetition of this idea across different cultures is one of the most fascinating patterns in human mythology. Take one of the oldest written stories in existence. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets recorded a great flood that destroyed nearly all life on Earth. The gods decided humanity had become too noisy and chaotic, and they resolved to wipe it away with rising waters. But one man was warned. His name was Utnapishtim. According to the story, a god secretly instructed him to build a massive boat and gather animals and his family before the waters came. The flood covered the land, cities vanished beneath the sea, and when the storm ended, Utnapishtim emerged into a silent new world. He was one of the few who remembered what had existed before. This story appears in the ancient Mesopotamian epic known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, written thousands of years ago. But what makes it remarkable is how similar it is to stories from other cultures. In the biblical tradition, a man named Noah builds an ark to survive a global flood. In Hindu mythology, a man named Manu is warned by a divine being that a great deluge will erase the world. In Greek tradition, Deucalion survives a similar catastrophe. These cultures developed independently across vast distances, yet they share the same core idea. The world ends, most people vanish, but someone survives to remember. At first glance, historians often explain these myths as exaggerated memories of real floods or natural disasters. Ancient communities living near rivers and coastlines would have experienced devastating floods. Over generations, those memories may have grown into grander stories about the destruction of the entire world. But the persistence of the sole survivor idea is curious. Why does the story so often focus on a single witness to the previous world? Perhaps because memory itself feels like a fragile bridge between realities. When a civilization collapses, most knowledge disappears along with it. Languages vanish, libraries burn, cities crumble into dust. But occasionally, fragments survive in the minds of a few individuals. Those survivors carry stories from the world that came before, and when they share those memories with future generations, the stories become legends. Imagine living through such a transition. Imagine witnessing a society slowly unravel. You remember the bustling markets that once filled the streets, the festivals, the voices of thousands of people moving through the city. Then the population begins to shrink. Families leave. Buildings fall silent.
Eventually, the place that once felt alive becomes a shadow of itself. If you lived long enough to see that transformation, you would carry memories that younger generations never experienced. To them, the ruins would look ancient, but to you, they would feel recent. You would remember the world before it ended. History contains many moments where individuals experienced something similar. Think about people who lived through the collapse of massive political systems. In 1989, a barrier that had divided Europe for decades suddenly fell. The concrete wall separating East and West Berlin, a symbol of Cold War tension, was opened by crowds celebrating in the streets. That moment became known as the fall of the Berlin Wall. For younger generations today, the Cold War is a historical chapter studied in textbooks. But for people who lived through it, the world before and after that night feels dramatically different. The political systems, alliances, and fears that once defined global life vanished almost overnight. They remember a reality that younger people never experienced. They remember the previous world. This pattern repeats whenever history undergoes dramatic change. There are always witnesses who remember what existed before. And sometimes their memories sound almost unbelievable to those who come afterward.
Imagine trying to explain life before the internet to someone born today. Or describing a time before airplanes, electricity, or modern medicine. Each technological leap reshapes the world so dramatically that the past begins to feel almost alien. But even those shifts are small compared to the transformations that mythology describes. Because myths rarely talk about simple political change. They talk about cosmic resets, floods that erase entire civilizations, fires that cleanse the earth, cycles where worlds are destroyed and recreated again and again. In Hindu cosmology, the universe itself moves through vast cycles known as yugas, ages that rise, decay, and eventually end before beginning again. In Norse mythology, a final battle called Ragnarok destroys the gods and the world itself, only for a new earth to rise afterward. Even in ancient Mesoamerican traditions, time was often imagined as repeating cycles of creation and destruction. These myths suggest something intriguing about how humans perceive existence. We instinctively imagine reality as something that doesn't last forever, something that can collapse and begin again. And if that cycle were real, if worlds truly did reset, then someone might occasionally slip through the transition. A witness, someone whose memory somehow survived the shift. In stories, that person often carries a heavy burden, because remembering a world that no longer exists can feel isolating. Everyone else believes reality has always been the way it is now, but the witness knows otherwise. They remember places that are gone, people who vanished, details that no longer match the world around them. At first, they might doubt themselves. Memory can play tricks after all, but the feeling would persist. That quiet awareness that something fundamental had changed, something everyone else had forgotten. It's a haunting idea, and yet in a strange way, it reflects something deeply human. Every generation carries memories that the next one does not. Every era leaves behind witnesses who remember how the world used to be. Over time, those memories fade. Eventually, the previous world becomes history, then myth, then nothing at all. Which leads us to the final question in this journey. If worlds can end quietly, if memory can fade or change, if history itself moves through cycles of transformation, then how would we recognize the next ending? Because if the past is any guide, the end of a world rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. It looks ordinary. It looks like everyday life continuing as usual. And that leads us to the final chapter of this story, a question that might be closer to our own moment in time than we like to imagine. What happens if the world ends tomorrow?
Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. Your alarm rings.
You reach for your phone and silence it the same way you always do. The screen glows softly in the early light, notifications stacking up just like every other day. Messages, news headlines, weather forecasts, nothing unusual. Outside, the city begins its familiar rhythm. Cars move through intersections. People hurry toward buses and trains. Somewhere, a cafe opens its doors and the smell of coffee drifts into the street. Everything looks normal. But imagine, for a moment, that something profound had already changed. Not the buildings, not the streets, but the underlying structure of the world itself. The rules governing society, technology, or even reality might have shifted in a way so subtle that no one noticed at first. History tells us this has happened before. Entire eras have ended quietly while people living inside them continued their routines, unaware that they had stepped into a new age. Consider the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. In the early 18th century, most humans still lived in agricultural societies. Life revolved around the seasons, the land, and local communities that had existed for generations. Then machines began to appear. At first, they seemed like small improvements, devices that made certain tasks faster or easier. But over time, those machines transformed the entire structure of civilization. Factories rose across Europe and North America. Railways connected distant cities. Steam engines powered ships that crossed oceans faster than ever before. Within a century, humanity had shifted from an agricultural world to an industrial one. For the people living through it, the change didn't feel like the end of the world. It felt like progress. Yet historians now recognize it as one of the most dramatic transformations in human history, a complete restructuring of how society functioned. The same pattern repeated again in the late 20th century. In 1989, a British computer scientist working at a research facility in Switzerland proposed a simple idea: a system that would allow documents stored on different computers to be linked together and accessed across networks. His name was Tim Berners-Lee. That proposal led to the creation of the World Wide Web. At the time, very few people realized how transformative the technology would become. But within a few decades, the internet reshaped nearly every aspect of human life. Communication, commerce, education, politics. Entire industries vanished. New ones appeared. Social relationships began forming across continents through invisible digital networks. The world that existed before the internet feels almost distant now, even though it existed only a few decades ago. Another quiet reset. And today, humanity may be standing on the edge of yet another transformation. Artificial intelligence is evolving rapidly. Biotechnology is advancing at astonishing speeds. Space exploration is expanding humanity's reach beyond Earth. Each of these developments has the potential to reshape civilization in ways we can barely predict. The question is not whether change will happen. History guarantees that it will. The question is whether we will recognize the moment when the next world begins. Because endings rarely look like endings when you are living inside them. They look like ordinary days, gradual shifts, small decisions accumulating until suddenly the landscape of reality feels unfamiliar. If the world ended tomorrow, most people might not experience a dramatic event. They might simply notice that life feels slightly different. Perhaps new technologies change how people interact with each other. Perhaps environmental changes alter the landscapes where cities stand. Perhaps cultural ideas shift so dramatically that the values of one generation seem unrecognizable to the next. These transitions happen slowly, but eventually historians look back and say something remarkable happened during that period. The world changed. A new era began. Which means the true end of a world is rarely the destruction of a planet. It is the disappearance of a way of life, a set of beliefs, a structure that once defined how people understood reality. And that realization leads to an unexpected conclusion.
The world has already ended many times before. The world of ancient empires ended. The world of medieval kingdoms ended. The world before electricity ended. The world before the internet ended. Each time humanity stepped forward into something new. Yet for the individuals living through those transitions, the moment probably felt ordinary. Just another sunrise, just another day. Which brings us back to the strange question we began with. What if the world ended yesterday and only you noticed? Maybe the buildings would still stand. Maybe your friends would still laugh at the same jokes. Maybe traffic would still crawl through the same crowded streets. But somewhere inside your mind would be a quiet awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Something about the world you remember no longer exists. Perhaps a belief that once shaped society has faded. Perhaps a technology has quietly rewritten how humans live. Perhaps the direction of history has turned in a way that only becomes obvious years later. If that feeling ever arrives, that sense that reality itself has crossed an invisible boundary, it might not mean the world literally ended, but it might mean you are witnessing the birth of a new one. Because the story of humanity is not a straight line. It is a series of worlds, rising and fading, one after another. And right now, at this very moment, we are living inside one of them. One day, thousands of years from now, historians, or whatever intelligence studies the past, may look back at our time and say something remarkable happened here. Something that marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. But for us, the people living inside this moment, the transition may feel almost invisible. Just another day, another sunrise, another quiet morning where everything seems exactly the same as yesterday. And that is what makes the idea so haunting, because if the world ever does end without us noticing, it will probably look exactly like today.